Restoring Men in History, the Boston Massacre. What significance for America? Read many sources on it. We're going to look at several sources, primary sources and other. And we're also going to take into account the account that Professor Douglas O'Linder put together at famous-trials.com, as well as the National Park Service and some others. Now, he starts by asking this question. Does the blame rest with the crowd of Bostonians who hurled insults, snowballs, oyster shells, and other objects at the soldiers? Or does the blame rest with an overreacting military that violated laws of the colony that prohibited firing at civilians? Well, you don't want a military in the city, right? But what I found interesting about the Boston Massacre is this. What do you want in America? What is an American principle? And this is my take. Do we want rule of law or rule of man? Rule of law or rule of mob? Rule of man or rule of oligarchy, right? If you like our mission, please like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification button. Let's get in. The professor gathered all these primary sources and transcripts. We're just going to take a small piece from them because they're voluminous. And it's well researched, but let's start with mps.gov, because that mps.gov started what happened before the Boston Massacre and what was going on. And this is what the National Park Service says. The most notable episode of this conflict cropped up over non-importation. The belief that colonies could dictate English policy by reducing goods purchased from England. We've talked about this before. Boston merchants and consumers who did not adhere to non-importation, what had happened to them? They became political targets, which is always fascinating because here they are fighting for freedom and telling people what to buy, right? And they risk open hostilities against them. In February 1770, a group of young boys attacked the shop of Theophilus Lilly. Ebenezer Richardson, a patron of Lilly's shop, attempted to clear the street, but only provoked the crowd more, which can happen sometimes, right? As Richardson retreated home, the group called Richardson an informer and berated him with verbal assaults. That happens with mobs, right? Sometimes. At Richardson's home, the crowd grew. Richardson attempted to disperse the crowd by threatening to fire upon them with his rifle. Crowd did not retreat, and Richardson fired birdshot in the crowd. What happened from that? It hit Samuel Gore and Christopher Sider, an 11-year-old boy. The boy died from the wounds. Now, here's interesting. Sam Adams, John Adams. Both are going to figure into this story. They were cousins. Now, here's the interesting thing. Sam Adams took that and made propaganda out of it. Here's the other interesting thing about that boy's funeral. Some sources say about 60% of the Boston residents went to that funeral. That's amazing, right? 60%. So you get what's being fired up before the Boston Massacre and all over the city once they brought the soldiers in, which was 1768, Britain. Things started erupting and there was conflicts all over. So it wasn't just the Boston Massacre. In the snowy winter of 1770, and this is back to the first piece, primary trial, the trial piece, many residents of Boston harbored deep resentment against the presence of the British military. Well, that would do it, right? We later put it in the Bill of Rights to stop and prevent that again. 2 regiments of regulars had been quartered in Boston since September of 1768, when they landed in response to a call by the governor to what? Restore order, respect British law. Trouble had arisen earlier that summer when Boston importers refused to pay required custom duties. Some Bostonians disliked soldiers because they competed for jobs. That can always be a problem, right? They were willing to take work for lower wages. They already had a job. Seamen saw the soldiers as enforcers of what? The impressment laws, which did what? Authorized persons to be seized and have to serve in the British Navy. So imagine that. You have to go to war against the country you love. Or work for the country you don't like. So clashes between civilians and soldiers were on the rise. By the way, another source stated as well, there were clashes between the loyalists and the colonists. So there were many kinds of clashes going on. On March 2nd, a fight broke out between soldiers and employees of John Gray's rope walk after one of the employees insulted a soldier. And here's part of the story, some of the stories you probably never heard. A cable making employee reportedly asked a passing soldier, "Do you want work?" When the soldier replied that he did, the employee told the soldier, "We then go and clean my toilet." But he didn't say it that nicely. The angry soldier later returned with about a dozen fellow soldiers, and guess what? A big fight ensued, right? The tragedy of March 5th began with a simple dispute going on whether a British officer had paid a bill to a local wig maker. I bet you've never heard this story. The officer was walking down King Street. That street is famous. We remember King Street. When Edward Garrick, the wig maker's apprentice, called out, "There goes the fellow who hath not paid my master for dressing his hair." The officer with the new hair, Captain John Goldfinch, passed on without acknowledging it. So it could have been okay. He went on. However, Garrick persisted, telling 3 passerbys that Goldfinch owed him money. He wouldn't let it go, right? Notice the soldier had gone on, ignored it. A lone sentry named Hugh White, and here we get to Hugh White. You may have heard of him. He overheard Garrick's remarks. White told the apprentice he is a gentleman, and if he owes you anything, he will pay for it. Garrick had an answer for that, which White wouldn't like. He said that there were no gentlemen left in the regiment. That upset White, caused him to leave his post and confront Garrick. After a brief exchange of words, the sentry struck Garrick with his musket, knocking him down. And then soon a small crowd, attracted by that conflict between White and Garrick, gathered around the lone guard, and they began what? Taunting him. What did they say, by the way? This is interesting. You've probably heard this before, the term. They called him bloody lobsterback, lousy rascal, lobster son of a bee. The crowd grew to about 50. Some of the mob, mostly young men, threw pieces of ice at White, and then he grew fearful. As the crowd continued to increase in size and hostility, White retreated from his sentry box to the custom house steps. He loaded his gun and he began to wave it about. He was scared. White knocked on the door and banged the butt of his door against the steps. Desperate, White yelled, "Turn out, main guard!" Meanwhile, a few blocks north, another confrontation between civilians and redcoats broke out. Under a barrage of snowballs, a group of soldiers, now get this, what do? They hustled back into the barracks. They didn't shoot. You never hear this story. A third mob, this one about 200 strong and carrying clubs. Clubs are pretty threatening, right? Gathered in Dock Square. A tall man with a white wig and a red coat did his best to rile up the crowd. So who was doing the riling right now? Trouble seemed to be erupting all over the city, the statements said. "Let's away to the main guard." So here they are getting away, someone shouted, and the crowd began streaming down an alley toward the famous, that's right, King Street. Someone pulled the fire bell rope at the brick meeting house, bringing dozens of more into the conflict. In the front of the main guard, officer for the day was, guess who? You've probably heard his name before. Captain Thomas Preston, that's right. He was pacing back and forth. This is a big decision for a commander, right? You got civilians and a crowd. What are you going to do? And you've got one of your men in trouble. You don't want to leave one of your men hanging, right? Paced back and forth for nearly 30 minutes, worrying about what to do. What would you do if you were the commander? If he did nothing, he thought, White might be killed by the mob. Now that's his soldier, remember. But he knew that also trying to intercede and save White would carry its own risk. Soldiers would be vastly outnumbered, he knew. Well, that's a great decision, isn't it? Here's another key point to the story. We have to remember this and keep this in mind. What else was going on in Preston's mind? What else would be going on in your mind? Province law, and Preston knew this, forbid the military from firing on civilians without the order of what? Without the order of a magistrate. Contemplating it, pacing, Preston made a decision. Turn out. Damn your bloods, turn out. He barked at his men. There was that engraving by Paul Revere, which was quite propagandistic. But Preston and his 7 other men lined up in columns of 2. They began moving briskly across King Street with empty muskets but fixed bayonets. They pushed on through the thick crowd near the custom house, and they managed to make it to White. Preston ordered the sentry to fall in. Preston then tried to get out. He was trying to get the men to safety. He wasn't looking for a fight. Preston tried to march them back to the main guard. But guess what happened? The mob began pressing in on them. They were hemmed in. The soldiers lined up about body length apart in a sort of semicircle facing the crowd that had grown to between now 50 and 100 people. So it's creasing, right? Many in the crowd threw various things, chunks of coal, snowballs, oyster shells. How would you like that coming at you? Sticks at the soldiers. Captain Preston warned them. He shouted at the crowd to disperse. And here's another famous guy coming up. Large club-wielding man named Crispus Attucks, 47-year-old man of mixed race, moved forward, grabbed one of the soldiers, Hugh Montgomery's bayonets, and knocked him to the ground. Montgomery rose, shouting, "Damn you, fire," and unloading his musket in the direction of the crowd. Soon after, estimates varied from 6 seconds to 1 over a minute. Montgomery shouted, "Fire." The other soldiers also began firing. A blast from the gun of Matthew Kilroy hit Samuel Gray as he stood with hands in his pockets, blowing a hole in his head as big as a hand. From another gun, 2 balls in Crispus Attucks' chest went to the chest. As the mob moved toward the soldiers, more guns fired. A 17-year-old apprentice to an ivory turner, as well as a sailor, were hit by balls fired into their chest. In all, 5 civilians lay dying in the streets. Another half dozen lay injured. The soldiers loaded their weapons and prepared to fire again when Captain Preston, according to his own statement, yelled, "Stop firing! Do not fire!" And there ended the Boston Massacre. But word of the shootings reached acting Governor Thomas Hutchinson in the North Square home. He rushed down to King Street to see what was going on. There he found a very angry crowd and a shaken Captain Preston. He confronted Preston. "Do you know, sir, you have no power to fire on any body of the public collected together except you have a civil magistrate with you. Give orders." After talking with Preston, Hutchinson proceeded upstairs in the townhouse where several members of the council had already gathered. He assured members that he would do his best to see what done. Justice done, and that's what we want in America, right? We want rule of law, not rule of man. So what's going to happen here? He stepped out on the balcony and he overlooked the crowd. What did he say? "Let the law have its course. I will live and die by the law." So Hutchinson was going to follow rule of law, not rule of man. This is what we want in America, right? Do we have it today? So they arrested Preston. And here's really one of my favorite parts of the story, where we meet a patriot. Later that morning, 34-year-old Boston attorney John Adams was visited. Now remember, his cousin Sam Adams is putting out all the propaganda for the funeral. He was visited in his office near the stairs of the town office by a Boston merchant. The Boston merchant, with tears streaming in his eyes, according to the recollection of Adams, the merchant James Force was his name, asked Adams to defend the soldiers and their captain, Thomas Preston. What did Adams think about that? Adams understood that taking the case would subject him to criticism. Now, we have that today, right? If you're going to take a case for certain people today in America, you can be punished as an attorney, actually, today for that. How many people today want to take cases that are unpopular and they're threatened, right? Many attorneys today are threatened. We remember what happened to some of President Trump and his people, right? Adams understood that taking the case would not only subject him to criticism, but might jeopardize his legal practice or even risk the safety of himself and his family. Now remember, he's very close to Abigail. So what would he do? What do you think he did? Well, Adams believed something. What did he believe? He believed that every person deserved a defense, and he took on the case without hesitation. For his efforts, he would receive the modest sum, get this, of 18 guineas. Now that is supposed to be America, ladies and gentlemen, where everyone gets a fair trial based on rule of law, not rule of man. Mass Gov states, although committed to freedom, as we know, John Adams was very committed to freedom from British tyranny. Adams believed that every person accused of a crime should have counsel and a fair trial. What would it take for Adams to succeed, ladies and gentlemen? Well, for Adams to succeed, he would have to persuade the jurors. Paul Revere had done a famous propaganda print. He would have to convince them that an out-of-control mob provoked the soldiers to fire in self-defense. I think Captain Preston was around jail about 7 months. The trial took place in October 1770. Adams and co-counsel Josiah Quincy challenged the prosecution's claim that Preston had ordered the soldiers to fire. There's a key component. And the jury. What did the jury do? Did Adams win or lose? Did Captain Preston win or lose? The jury was composed of colonists, by the way. And their tensions were high, remember. This was a city that was inflamed and had a lot of angst against the British. However, Captain Preston was acquitted. I'll give the answer away. The trial of the 8 soldiers began in November 1770. Adams and Quincy called witnesses who testified that the unruly mob assaulted and provoked the soldiers. Adams' closing argument, and this is fantastic. This is just a great closing argument. Contemporaries described it as electrifying. Argued to the jury that any soldiers whose life were in danger had acted in self-defense. As to any soldiers whose lives were not threatened, but who were provoked to act from blows, sticks, balls, Adams argued they were guilty of manslaughter, but not murder. Here is the fantastic summation from John Adams. He concluded with these words. This is from the primary source. I will enlarge no more on the evidence, but submit it to you. Facts are stubborn things. And whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. Nor is the law less stable than the fact. If an assault was made to endanger their lives, the law is clear. They had a right to kill in their own defense. If it was not so severe as to endanger their lives, yet if they were assaulted at all, struck and abused by blows of any sort, by snowballs, oyster shells, cinders, clubs, or sticks of any kind, this was a provocation for which the law reduces the offense of killing down to manslaughter in consideration of those passions in our nature, which cannot be eradicated. To your candor and justice I submit the prisoners and their cause, the law, and all vicissitudes of government, fluctuations of the passions, or flights of enthusiasm, will preserve a steady, undeviating course. It will not bend to uncertain wishes, imaginations, and wanton tempers of men. To use the words of a great and worthy man, a patriot, and a hero, an enlightened friend of mankind, and a martyr to liberty. I mean, Algernon Sidney, who from his earliest infancy sought a tranquil retirement under the shadow of the tree of liberty, with his tongue, his pen, his sword. Law, says he, no passion can disturb. 'Tis void of desire and fear, lust and anger. Written reason, retaining some measure of the divine perfection, does not enjoin that which pleases a weak, frail man, but without any regard to persons, commands that which is good, and punishes evil in all, whether rich or poor, high or low. 'Tis deaf, inexorable, and flexible. On the one hand, it is inexorable to the cries and lamentations of the prisoners. On the other, it is deaf, deaf as an adder to the clamors of the populace. MassGov states Adams' experiences in the case would guide him as he developed and articulated his philosophy of government based on the rule of law. That's what we wanted to talk about today, rather than the rule of individuals. It also reinforced his belief that the judicial branch should be independent and not controlled by passions of the day. Years later, Adams described his role in defending the British soldiers charged with murder as one of the most gallant, generous, manly, and disinterested actions of my whole life, and one of the best pieces of service I ever rendered to my country. In America, we all need a fair trial. We all need to be represented. We need to have faith in the judges and the justice system. Lawfare today is going on where you can be attacked and lose all your money. Some attorneys are attacked for defending people, making it more difficult to get representation. That's not a good thing in America. Neither one is. Because in America, what do we need? It's an American principle. John Adams talked about it. We want to need rule of law, not rule of man. That's why we're looking at the Boston Massacre today. They got it. Captain Preston and the soldiers got a fair trial in America at a time when there was great animosity. British soldiers, colonists, and a lot of conflicts going all over Boston, but they still got the fair trial. They still got representation. John Adams was willing to take the heat and be attacked for defending them. We need fair trials and representation. We need rule of law. John Adams knew that. It's an American principle. And here in America, we need to return to rule of law, not rule of man. Thank you. If you like our mission, please like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification button.